Today, we have a special guest, Léopold Dobelle, a leading figure in climate technology and the mind behind Mitico, a company that plays a pivotal role in global efforts to combat climate change, offering a range of services that span the entire carbon capture value chain. Climate change remains one of the most pressing challenges of our time. According to the United Nations, to avoid the worst impacts, global emissions need to be reduced by almost half by 2030 and reach net zero by 2050. These ambitious targets highlights the need for urgent and innovative solutions like carbon capture to act as a palliative remedy, buying us crucial time while we transition to more sustainable energy sources. In this episode, we will discuss the current state of climate affairs, the critical role of reducing CO2 emissions, and how technologies like carbon capture can bridge the gap as we strive for a sustainable future. Join us as Léopold Dobelle shares his insights and the journey of his team in making a tangible impact on climate change mitigation. Léopold, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for the invitation and the warm introduction.
Let's get started with the basics. What is carbon capture in simple terms?
Yeah, definitely. So carbon capture, if you're learning about climate and energy, it's a very trendy term right now, a very trendy sentence that we use in a lot of different ways. Carbon capture has been there for almost 100 years now. When we talk about carbon capture, there is basically two big families of doing carbon capture. The process of carbon capture is extracting CO2 from an environment to put it somewhere else, as easy as that. There is two main applications of carbon capture. One called direct air capture. It's the process of extracting CO2 from the atmosphere itself. As we know, the concentration of CO2 is increasing in the atmosphere since the industrial era. So some people are building machines and companies to really have an impact on this raising concentration in the atmosphere. What we do at Mitico is slightly different, and that's the other approach, which is collecting CO2, carbon dioxide, before it enters the atmosphere. So this method, it's called point source carbon capture. And like the name is defining it, we're basically tackling carbon dioxide emissions at the source. So we collect those carbon emissions from industrial processes, for example.
So if we were to picture it in a very simple, easy way for the audience to think about it, it's like if you had a car and in the exhaust pipe, you had a machine that is just breathing that air before it goes out to the environment. But picture that in a factory.
Exactly. Yeah, definitely. So if you look at the process of point source carbon capture, there is an analogy we like to use in environmental science, and it works pretty well for carbon capture to explain those two different approaches and why we think ours is very interesting. If you consider the world and the atmosphere as a big bathtub with water inside, water being the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, there is an open faucet. We are dumping CO2 in the atmosphere every year by a huge amount. There's this water coming out of this faucet, increasing the volume of water in the bathtub. What we're doing is to propose a solution to close the faucet to make sure that the volume of water doesn't raise into the bathtub. So that's basically the idea behind point source carbon capture. If you look at the other approach, which is direct air capture, it would be kind of like going with a spoon trying to empty the volume of water in the bathtub while the faucet is still open. So that's our approach, and we think that's why we think it's the most interesting.
Very interesting indeed. You said carbon capture has been around for 100 years. Wow, that blew my mind. Tell us more about how widespread right now is the implementation of the solutions that you mentioned, either direct or point source, and who are the biggest players in the industry right now?
Yeah, definitely. It's still a novel technology in a way. There's not a lot of applied project and system out there, simply because the market is being created as the technologies are constantly evolving and being developed. So those technologies application are driven by how much money they can provide, and with the problem that they can solve. But at the end of the day, companies are trying to be economically in a benefit. So it's always difficult when the market is completely being created as we're talking. But however, we have like hubs of kind of like efforts being created around carbon capture. You have the biggest one in Alberta in Canada. There was about $1.8 billion invested. It's one of the largest center for carbon capture and storage. You also have one that is big in Europe, called Northern Lights. It's a project that was led by companies like Total Energy, and their goal is basically by 2035 to collect 25% of the European market, so the European carbon emissions. So you have like big projects with a lot of investments being created. The biggest players are usually corporate organisms. So we talked about Total Energy. We also have Shell, Chevron, really looking actively into carbon capture and investing some of their resources. Also, Mitsubishi is big into those type of processes.
How badly do we need carbon capture? And it is part of your mantra, right? Basically, what you're saying and what you were explaining about that bathtub.
Yeah.
If we just focus on transitioning to green energy, is that enough? Do we have enough time, or do we need to do something very quickly about carbon capture?
Yeah. So unfortunately, the clock is ticking, and we all know the goals of carbon neutrality by 2050. So like you mentioned in your introduction, by 2035, we need to cut by half, a little bit less than half, 45% all carbon emissions, and by 2050, the goal is to be carbon neutral. We want to go into a world where we don't use fossil fuels anymore and use as many renewable energy sources as possible. Some roadmap are kind of like suggesting to reach this goal to use that 90% of the energy demand in 2050 would come from renewable sources of energy. But those 90% of energy needed, as the demand continues to rise, it requires an entire modernization and transformation of the grid to provide this electricity to houses and everywhere, made from renewable energy sources. So this transformation of the grid requires a huge amount of investment, but also relies on manufacturing processes and so on fossil fuel. Unfortunately, we're not going to completely cut down our use of fossil fuel in those coming years. So there will always be a need and kind of like a dependency on fossil fuel. So that's why carbon capture is a relevant solution for that. So yeah, that's the idea. Like, hopefully we can, have everything with renewable sources of energy, but that will require massive amount of investment and the use of fossil fuel eventually. So yeah.
Got it. Let's talk a little bit about size, but again, trying to simplify for the audience. Like, if you had to say in simple numbers, how much carbon is out there? How much do we generate per year? And
yeah,
how much do we need to, how can we make a dent on that,
yeah.
those huge numbers?
So the carbon budget. So every year, the world is emitting 37 gigatons of CO2. If you simplify like the different sources of this CO2, you basically have 20%, a bit more than 20% coming from various industries. You have a bit less than 20% coming from transportation, and then you have about 35 to 36% of those 37 gigatons coming from energy. So basically, most of the CO2 that we are creating every year is coming from the energy generation. How do we make a dent? How do we tackle those CO2 emissions? So to give you an order of magnitude, today, as of right now, we are capturing and collecting 40 million tons of CO2 every year using carbon capture. So that's less than 0.2%. So it's still like very, very, very small. Like we said before, we will always need fossil fuel for different processes. If we want to reduce by 45% our carbon emissions by 2030, we need to capture 1.6 gigatons of CO2. So there's a huge improvement and development that we need to do by 2030. So there's a huge market opportunity, but also we need every solutions on board for every different industrial processes to be able to kind of like match those goals. But yeah, you have a roadmap on how we can reach those neutrality goals, and they suggest by 2030 we need to capture 1.6 gigaton of CO2, and we are pretty far away from that. So that's why we kind of like have companies like ours trying to develop solutions relevant to specific processes and that can be applicable as soon as possible. By 2050, some of those roadmaps suggest that we need to capture 7.6 gigatons of this CO2. So the market will be always growing. And as of right now, we only have a small impact on those global emissions, but hopefully with more projects like ours, we will be able to do more.
Lots of opportunities for growth as well. It's weird, but lots of opportunities for growth. Tell us more about your carbon capture technology and what do you think it's the potential impact on mitigating industrial emissions?
Yeah, so we come with a kind of like a novel aspect of doing carbon capture, not on the process. By that I mean we kind of like we take CO2 in a low concentration and we can provide a high purity of CO2. So our job is to do on the technology part, the capture, so transforming low concentration to high purity CO2. And then we are kind of like teaming up with local user of CO2 or people who can transform this CO2. There's other companies also doing that in everywhere in the world. So we're kind of like getting in touch with them. Our process specifically and how it is better than kind of like conventional processes already doing carbon capture. It's in the chemistry that we're using. So we're using a prehistorical chemistry. We're using a carbonate cycle. And so this carbonate cycle will allow to absorb CO2 and then release CO2 in a very cost-effective way. We are using some basically earth abundant material to drive this chemistry. You can think about it as like a chemical sponge. So it's basically we're absorbing CO2 and then we're releasing it. The chemistry is very well known, and the material that we're using is very safe and non-toxic. That's the big difference and advantage of our technology compared to conventional processes. By being cheaper, we can also be safer. Where like conventional state-of-the-art processes, like using, for example, amine solvents, they have the solvent, by the nature of their solvent, they have harmful byproducts as they operate, which is not our case. We have a chemistry that is safe with a sorbent that is safe for nature and people. So this is our opportunity here, being cheaper, being safer, and then we can think of other advantages on the way to operate the system and so on, but that's getting a bit more into the details. So yeah.
Tell me more about the release part. What do you do?
Yeah.
You capture the carbon and then you said a few things, right? You can release it. I've seen some people that are just plugging in, down to earth, right? And
Yeah.
converting that into rocks. There are users of carbon. tell us a bit more for the uninitiated in carbon capture, what happens, right?
Yeah. So we talked about before of those big hubs and projects where there's companies. So in Canada, for instance, or in Northern Europe, where there's like kind of like companies all coming together to absorb CO2 from the atmosphere or from industrial processes, and then do the entire value chain of CO2. So that we call CCUS, so carbon capture, utilization, and storage. So basically, you have a site over there where you can take your CO2 and sequester it in the ground, doing geological sequestration. So you have pockets where, for instance, oil was taken before, and then now they're empty, so they can be filled up with CO2.
Wow.
And basically, the CO2 in context of like specific minerals will turn into rocks, and it will be permanently sequestered on the ground. We have about, from what we are emitting every year, we have about 1 million years available of sequestration sites right now. So it's not a limiting resource or process. We can explore this possibility for CO2, for the end life of CO2. And so the question is always like, for like, what's the cost behind it? So that's why you have all those companies together trying to reduce the cost as much as possible and making this solution completely viable for the CO2 that we're emitting today.
And what inspired you, right? What inspired
Yeah.
you to delve into this field, to be a co-founder of Mitico? Tell us more about that journey.
Yeah. I'm gonna talk more about like a global level of like, what's is inspiring us in our company, and then kind of like dive into the personal stuff.
Okay.
We really realized that, we're based in Los Angeles in California, and we know that we are in a very wealthy region of the world. We have access to investments from the government for renewable resources to kind of like clean up the air and find new way of like generating electricity and energy in general, but also transportation. We know that those resources are not available everywhere in the world. And for instance, developing countries, it's not their priority, and they don't want to spend money kind of on like cleaning up their processes on manufacturing processes and the way they are generating energy. So there is a big gap on like what we want to achieve in this wealthy part of the world, and what other people, like what they can do with their own resources and the way they're developing their countries. So we want to kind of like make this technology and opportunity like accessible to as many people as possible. So we're developing the technology here in the US, but we know at some point that we want to develop the technology and service in other parts of the world. For instance, we're talking with like certain projects in Thailand, overseas, and all of that, to potentially also implement the system over there. So that's kind of like the inspiration is making sure we can have a solution to mitigate carbon emissions all over the world. And me personally, what inspires me was, I mean, what inspired me at the very early stage to kind of like start the company was like the people I was working with, and the people I was kind of like had in my circle. I was working in this research lab at Caltech, California Institute of Technology, doing environmental science and engineering, and I was kind of like, in this field of working on new technologies they have an like how can I say, like a connection with the environment, and how can we optimize some systems and all of that, mostly oriented towards water. And I was working with a lot of like very inspiring people that was really all devoted and passionate about this field of like the environment, and mixing it with like how can we bring science and engineering, and really for purpose of like a better environment and a better planet kind of. So a very inspiring environment. And so I was working with those people, and we kind of like we're trying to find a way to have like a big marginal impact. So kind of like finding an idea that we could develop, and we knew would have a lot like a significant impact on the climate. And that's how we came across carbon capture and found our solution that is actually really relevant for point source applications. And so that's, I was very inspired by those people and the different projects around me. So that's how it started. And now like what inspires me today is just seeing like how much progress we can make, and with such a lean team of 5 people, we can there's so much we can do, and we're super inspired by that. So yeah, it's great.
Very nice. Do you, on a daily basis, do you
Yeah.
feel, do you, I guess some days are harder than others and you're struggling to different things, and we're going to talk about challenges in a bit, but is this something you remember? Do you feel that sense of being proud about what you're doing and the impact that it has? Because not a lot of people work in something that has such a, kind of a good impact on the
Yeah.
planet and on the future. Is that something you
Yeah.
remember often, and you take a moment to just breathe, relax, and appreciate what you're doing? Or does the
Yeah.
daily grind, do you forget about that and just become part of it? How does it
You
feel?
kind of like, yeah, honestly, you kind of like forget about it at some point, because you're so like how can I say, you so focused on like how fast you want to move, and we're like we really want to develop this technology as quickly as possible, and reach an entry to market as quick as possible, because we really think it can have an impact for those industrial emitters. Um, but so yeah, I forgot the first part of your question actually.
Yeah, you are answering the question. Basically, you forget about that feeling proud and gratification because you are just so focused on what's next, how can we expand, how can we grow, how can we get more investors, how can we get more clients, how do we
Yeah,
do what we are doing with just 5 people and we stay lean
yeah,
and we stay achieving impact. You're focusing on achieving that impact, and that maybe sometimes takes you away from just realizing like, hey,
yeah.
I feel good, I'm
Yeah,
doing a great thing.
it's a little difficult because there's so much going on, and we're talking to like so many companies and so it's sometimes it's hard to take a step back and just like realize and but always grateful for sure. And what I like the most is seeing, like I mentioned before, like what we can achieve with such a small team of 5 people. We are only 2 years old, and we're already talking about implementing our technology on the field to test it in Canada this year. And it's kind of, when you take a step back, it's amazing, because 2 years ago we're still in the lab building, like collecting some data on a small reactor, and we didn't even know if this thing would work or not. And then 2 years after, we got a grant from basically the Department of Energy in Canada to really basically to sponsor the project and implement it in Canada, and test the technology at scale in relevant applications. So it's super, yeah, no, definitely very grateful for that. And it's important, as you say, to take a step back and realize that that's looking at the basically the route that we've done, and how far we are right now. And there's still a lot we need to do, but it's definitely a good feeling.
Yes, sir. Talking about what you need to do and some of the challenges, what are the biggest challenges you faced and you still face in terms of growing and getting where you want to go?
um I would say like one of the biggest challenges, I talked about it a little bit before, is this entire market for carbon capture is still very recent, and it's being developed with like new policies, new pressure from like government agencies and the government in general. Um, so it's not like we are disrupting completely something that is already being sold and generating and
Right.
taking like generating a lot of like millions of revenue, and we're taking a share in this market. No, we're talking about kind of like almost predicting the market and how big it's gonna be, and how like how much our technology can be applied to that. And you realize that, you know, a lot of people, when we did a lot of like customer discovery through the NSF, through NSF, which is National Science Foundation, they have a program that they call iCore for customer discovery that we were part of last year. So we did about 100 interviews actually over like 7 weeks, and we talked to a bunch of people and their potential needs for a solution like ours, so carbon capture. You realize that a lot of people are not happy, you know, when, you know, we have a plant operating, they don't want to change like
Yeah.
their they don't want to put investment into it because their margin is always like super slim, and they don't want to bother with like new project and all of that. So yeah, it's still tricky because basically um they know they have to do it because of new policies and all of that. They're not just good people that want to cut down their emissions. I mean, some of them are, but you know, like everyday people, it's not your top priority, right? So we kind of like talked with those people, and yeah, they are looking into it, but it's not like they're super excited and all of that. So they go really deep into the numbers and how much, you know, this
Yep.
system will cost, and how much money they could make or they could lose. So it's very there's a big attention to details on, like, you know, is like our solution economically viable or not when we're talking to customers, and that's a big challenge for sure.
Two questions on that. Is there a market? So there is the carbon certificates market, right? Some companies
Yeah,
can deduct taxes, etc., and even generate money from reducing emissions, right? So that's one piece where you have a very clear business case for a company that goes like, hey, should I implement Mitico's carbon capture system in my industry or not, right?
yeah.
That's a very clear one. Um, but are you also seeing that there are any players in the industry that want to buy the what you are capturing and concentrating, like, I don't know, like soda producers,
Yeah,
etc., etc.? Are there some places where you can sell all the carbon that you're capturing?
yeah, definitely. So there is like the market is driven by kind of like um two uh two dynamics kind of. We have small scale applications, so we're talking about like anything below like 10,000 tons of CO2 per year, um which is basically our first application could be for like small point source you know, systems like this. um there is a need of like actually revalorizing the CO2 for beverage company, like you said. um and basically the price of a ton of CO2 for those applications goes in the US between $250 and $400. So what we can do for small point source emissions is collecting this CO2 and then selling to like other companies that are using CO2 in their system. You're gonna say that, you know, as you open the can and you're drinking, the CO2 will go back into the atmosphere. Yes, but you know, as we tackle it from industrial processes, we also kind of like make sure we are reducing the overall annual budget of CO2. So that's for the like small applications. So that the driven the market is driven by actual utilization. And then when it comes to larger scale systems, so we're talking about big natural power plants, so like millions of tons of CO2 per year. Then the market is driven more by like capturing the CO2 and then sequestering it. And then the source of revenue, instead of selling it to beverage company between 250 and 400, the revenue here is more the carbon credits. So
Right.
like you mentioned, the certificates. And so per ton of CO2, the emitter, so for instance, the natural gas power plant can claim up to $85 per ton of CO2.
Got it.
So for them, it could be a new source of revenue, because let's say they have X amount of ton of CO2 per year. They can have $85 per ton of this CO2, and our system costs all landed $60, for example. Then they can have those $25 extra for them, and so it's a new source of revenue. So
Right.
we're kind of like um, taking advantage of this dynamic for them to offer them, you know, an advantage of, like, you know, to highlight the advantage of carbon capture and the service that comes behind. but also kind of like generating revenue.
Is that the biggest challenge for scalability for any company doing carbon capture right now? The market and finding value to it and convincing industries that they have to do it?
Not really. I would say the challenge it is tied to scalability, but that's the cost of scalability.
Okay.
Because we're building hardware, it's very capital intensive.
Oh,
Uh, for example, a plant that is generating 500 megawatt, which is a big, a big power plant. The cost of a plant like this is about $1 billion. The system, the carbon capture system that we would add is about $100 million. So it's like another 10%
right.
of the cost of the plant. But yeah, the challenge here is like how much money you need to build your system, because we're building hardware and we need like all the infrastructure behind. So that's the challenging part. All system can be scalable, but you always depend on like how much it's gonna cost you.
Got it. How do you see Mitico evolving in the future? Where are you going? What things will change in the future for Mitico?
So the way we sit, we're already talking with like different of our advisors, and to kind of like open local entities of companies. So we talked about Canada before. We're also like exploring applications in Switzerland. The way we see it right now, that's kind of like a question we're currently answering is what is our go-to-market strategy, and how much we're going to generate growth into the company. Should we start by like smaller point source applications with smaller systems, or kind of like raise, go directly to a bigger system that can be connected to a large power plant, for instance.
Right.
But the way we see it is having multiple system across the world, mostly Canada, US, and Europe for now, and then kind of like expand it to like other countries according to the different opportunities. But that's where those countries, that's where there's like the most incentive, because we talked about it, it's like wealthy part of the world, so there's a lot of
Yep.
incentives on implementing carbon capture. So it's a good way to kind of like show a proof of concept, showing that the technology works and it's economically viable, and try to expand it as much as possible.
Got it. How about specific partnerships? You mentioned about Europe. You mentioned about the very, you know, aggressive targets that they have, and you mentioned big players, right? Total,
Yeah.
Chevron, Shell, etc. Um, is that something that you would like in the future of Mitico, partnering with some of those big players in the industry, or do you prefer to remain more independent? Yeah, I'm asking from an ignorant point of
Yeah,
view.
yeah.
How does that work?
No, we would like to, because the basically the bigger the player, as soon as you have a small impact, then your impact is like exponential, right? So
Right.
if you're like a company like Chevron, for instance, that have like their entire scope 1 to 3 are representing a lot of CO2 emissions, if you start implementing solutions for that, then your impact behind can be huge, because they're such a big company, right? However, it's very hard to get into, to get those some of those partnerships going. So we need to prove that the technology is viable, and so on. But yeah, to answer your question, definitely that would be very, very exciting, and we would like to have those type of partnerships for sure.
Will you define yourself as optimistic by nature?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, I would say so. Yeah.
Is Because I was going to ask, and then I already knew the answer, of course, but
Yeah.
as an entrepreneur, do you think, and as an entrepreneur for solutions for climate change, do you find any people working on your industry that is not optimistic, that is not faithful, that things can change? It's kind of a prerequisite to work in your industry,
Oh
or
yeah, definitely. Yeah. No, if you're not optimistic, you're not in a good in a good business, in a good world. No, you have to be super optimistic, and frankly, like it's not hard to be, honestly. There is a lot of very passionate people, and very like highly driven and educated people working to have an impact on climate change. So I'm super hopeful about the development of not only carbon capture, but other source of like other way of like having new technologies, improving our lives and having an impact to solve and mitigate climate change. I'm super hopeful about it. When you see all the different projects growing and actually achieving like a level of success, I'm yeah, very, very hopeful actually.
Do you think those projects get enough media attention? You are well aware of it, right? You know what's going
Yeah,
on. But maybe when you talk to friends that are not in your industry and are not as exposed as you are,
yeah.
do you find that they don't really know what's going on? You're like, hey, but this technology is almost there and it will change everything, etc. How does that work in your mind?
Yeah, sometimes it's a little hard because we assume that everybody knows about it because we're so much into this space and we learn so much about all those different news. But yeah, I mean, I have friends doing like completely different things and no, they don't know anything about it because it's only when you kind of like start learning about a different project that's you see like how much is going on, but at the same time I feel like and climate and like climate change and how we should have an impact is more and more into the common discussions, and as you see, the young generation has a lot more kind of like interest into being proactive when it comes to that. So I would say we talk more about it, definitely more. But still like the new technologies when it gets into the gritty details, it's a different thing. But I would say no, we talk more and more about those different. We talk a lot about the issues, not so much about the solutions. But it's getting better, I feel.
Perfect. Yeah, I want to be super honest. When I talked to you and when I was getting ready for this episode and you were showing me different articles and hey, read this to learn more about what we're going to be talking about,
Yeah,
I felt very good because I was like, wow, there are many things here I didn't know. I had no idea. And I'm
yeah,
sure
yeah,
there's a lot of people listening to us that probably didn't know about what carbon capture is and that it's even possible, right?
yeah,
And some of the
yeah,
things that you say. And I, it feels good. It feels good to talk to people like you, to learn about the things that you're doing. And I'm happy that there's a lot of people like your team doing the things that you're doing. One final question to you, Leopold. What do you do when you are not working, if there is any such a time?
no, definitely. I think it's there's definitely a time when I and the rest of the team is not working. And I think it's something very important. And that having a balance is you need to have some sort of like balance because otherwise it's just too much. There's just too much going on. So it's something that we actually try to promote as much as possible, making sure everybody is like kind of like in a good headspace, and have and the way you achieve that is having a good balance between work and life. Um, so I'm always trying to stay active as much as possible. I'm uh I'm grateful and lucky to be in the city of Los Angeles, where the weather is always very nice. So as much as possible outside, we have great parks around, great hikes. The ocean is just there, and there's a lot of surfing and all of that. So really like it here. Um, and yeah, California in general is nice. There's a lot of like diversity when it comes to the nature and stuff. So trying to be as outside as much as possible, trying to be active as much as possible because that's my way of being mentally healthy, I would say. Some other people is like maybe music or like all the things. For me, it's more like being active and working out and things like this. So I try to do that as much as possible, keeping a good balance. And honestly, that's the secret. I feel it's when you find your rhythm, and you can allow yourself to work as much as possible and do as much as possible, then yeah, it's only a game of patience and resilience, I feel.
Beautiful. And going out and spending time with the nature and enjoying the clean air. right? Which for you
Yeah,
is,
the air, I don't know, it's not that clean in Los Angeles,
I know,
unfortunately.
but you know, it, when you
Yeah,
can in the mountains or whatever, you know, it's
yeah.
cleaner, right?
Yeah, definitely. No, there are places to escape in outside the city, and it's like it's super pretty, right into the nature. But yeah, when it comes to LA, unfortunately, there's so much traffic, and the way the city is constructed with the mountains, it's an entire. It's funny because when I was back at Caltech, there's a huge department, huge work being done on atmospheric chemistry, and a lot of people were actually studying the different chemical reaction and chemical effects, of the pollution on the atmosphere, and what's going on above the city of Los Angeles. So we had like those students in labs going taking samples from the air every once in a while. So kind of like cool to hear about those stuff. But yeah, no, LA not so great for that, but the rest of it outside is
but
is very nice.
but it reminds you of your mission to continue cleaning the air. Uh,
Definitely, that's for sure. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Leopold, this has been great. I appreciate you. Thank you so much for being here, and I hope that we can continue talking. I want to learn
Yeah,
more about where
definitely.
you are with Mitico, and sometime maybe in the future we do this again. And you
Yeah,
are
for sure.
certainly bigger and in implementing your solutions in many places around the world.
Yeah, would love to keep in touch, and yeah, hopefully, as you said, the company will continue to grow, and will have an impact as soon as possible. And yeah, if for anybody interested, we're super active on LinkedIn if you want to kind of like see what we're doing. Yeah,